Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak about this. And I've been investigating research misconduct in the UK and abroad for many years, and I've reported more than 25 doctors to the GMC. I would say that I've investigated it in places like Bangladesh, which of course is one of the most corrupt countries in the world, but they do the investigation of research fraud rather better than the UK GMC, and dealt with it far better. And in fact, they realised the problem, so they invited me to chair an investigation. They brought an Australian and Americans because they realised there are problems with conflicts of interest and who you know. And in that case, 4 of the witnesses said they'd received death threats for the whistleblowers. So my first involvement with research misconduct was in the 1980s, and I'll speak about that in a moment. And I've also been threatened with legal action several times by doctors and institutions, 3 times by King's College London for reporting misconduct at their institutions. And I was sued for libel 4 times by a medical device company, NMT Medical. I was the principal investigator, cardiologist, in a trial of their device. I was co-principal investigator. I was the principal cardiologist and co-principal investigator. And I was concerned that they were misreporting the results of the trial. And I said so at a meeting, and they sued me for libel and slander 4 times, for different times I spoke. And those actions went on for 4 years until they went into liquidation. And my costs were over 300,000, but I got most of that back because we'd got money paid into court. And what was interesting in that case is that the other co-principal investigator agreed to be the author of the paper that was published in circulation. I reported him to the GMC. He was found guilty of dishonesty and suspended from the medical register. He'd failed to disclose his share ownership in the company, his enormous amounts of payments, £2,000 a week for the 4 years of the trial, and little things like that, as well as the fact that the data was false, which was published. And interestingly, he had a record. He'd appeared before the GMC for falsifying earlier research in an entirely unrelated clinical trial and been found guilty of misconduct in that. And the interesting thing for me was that the medical device company had used him in the trial, knowing that he had already been found to have falsified research in an entirely unrelated trial. So my interest in research misconduct was started when I was working on a drug called Amrinone for patients with heart failure, or hopefully for patients with heart failure, in the early 1980s. And I found it to be ineffective and had horrific side effects. 50% of patients developed thrombocytopenia, others got eosinophilia, myositis, polyserositis. And I told the company that it didn't work and was dangerous, and they asked me to change the data. And I said, well, I couldn't do that. And they then suggested that they would give me the equivalent of 2 years' salary if I didn't publish at all. And I said I had to publish, so they then threatened legal action. So I went ahead and published, and when I published on the side effects of the drug, I was contacted 10 days later by Dr. Offerhouse from the Netherlands Committee for the Evaluation of Medicines, who said he did not understand my paper on the side effects because the side effects were not in my clinical records forms. And I said, well, they are. I've got copies of my clinical records forms. And he compared what the company had submitted and my clinical records form, and they had submitted forgeries. This is a large multinational pharmaceutical company, now part of Sanofi. And so the drug was withdrawn throughout Europe, but they were still pressing ahead with marketing and research in the USA. And in 1984, they told the US Food and Drug Administration that they were withdrawing the drug from research and use worldwide because in the first 1,200 patients given the drug, there had been over 1,400 life-threatening side effects. So on average, more than one life-threatening side effect per patient. But 2 years later, in '86, I discovered that the company was still marketing the drug in Africa and Asia, where you could buy it over the counter without a prescription, when it was considered too dangerous to have on a doctor's prescription in Europe and North America. So I went to Oxfam and said, could their reps in these countries get proof of purchase, which they did, and we then took it to the WHO, the evidence, and embarrassed the company into withdrawing the drug worldwide. But there were no prosecutions in the UK for breaches of the Medicines Act in this country because the company told the Department of Health if prosecuted they would shut down pharmaceutical manufacturing in the UK, and they had a very big manufacturing plant near Newcastle upon Tyne. The GMC refused to investigate any of the doctors working for the company that had threatened and offered me bribes. I asked the BMJ, Lancet Nature to publish what had happened, and they said they couldn't take on a multinational pharmaceutical company. So I then went to the Guardian newspaper, which published on the front, back, and a full inside page, and then subsequent stories, because their lawyers said that all the evidence was there. So that's how I got interested in research misconduct, and there are a number of forms. You all know about falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism, but there's also duplicate publication, which affects meta-analysis. There's failure to retract fraudulent publications, which of course affects the treatment patients receive. There's problems with ethics approval and informed consent. If you design a trial badly, you may not get data that gives you an answer, or if you've not done a literature review properly, you may be wasting your time because the answer may already be known and you're putting patients at risk. Delay in or failure to publish results, of course, also adversely affects meta-analysis, and failure to disclose conflicts of interest are obviously a problem. And many of these things involve misuse of research grants, which is often financial fraud. So the impact of research misconduct is obvious that it harms patients, it wastes resources, and undermines public trust in science if the fraud is known. But of course it can be beneficial for career advancement in fraudsters and for the profits of healthcare products if they get away with it. How prevalent is it? Well, we don't know because of course it's secret. We only know about the cases we know about, not the ones that escape attention. But Stephen Locke, when he was the editor of the BMJ in '88, did a survey and found that half of the UK academics he consulted knew of cases of research fraud, but in only 8% of cases of fraud was the fraudulent papers retracted, and in only 3% of cases was the fraudster dismissed. Retraction Watch was started in 2010. Yeah, it is 2010. And that year they had 200 retractions, and it's risen exponentially. So last year there were over 18,000 retractions. And there are big hitters, so to speak, in retraction. Dr. Fuji with 183 retracted papers, anaesthetist, and a couple of top hitters are anaesthetists, but there are also a couple of cardiologists in there. And I put asterisk next to the name of John Darcy and Bob Slutsky for a particular reason, and because I know for absolute certainty that their colleagues and superiors knew what was going on for a long time. In Slutsky's case, they knew for more than 5 years that he was falsifying data. And John Darcy was at Harvard. He was in Eugene Brimward's department. Brimward is the most cited cardiologist in the world. He was the first cardiologist appointed to the National Academy of Science in the US. And he knew that Darcy was falsifying research and let him continue. And that is confirmed in the inquiry report. It was brought to his attention and his junior, Dr. Kloner's attention. Now, Slutsky was in San Diego. Now, the interesting thing about the Slutsky, and it may be a coincidence, believe it if you wish, that it was a coincidence, but the department in which Slutsky was falsifying his research for many years was the department that Eugene Brumwood had worked at and headed before he moved to Harvard. And when he moved to Harvard, he left his deputy, John Ross, in charge of the department at San Diego. And it was in John Ross's department that Bob Slutsky was falsifying research. I went there in '81, and people, not only the cardiologists, but people in other departments, microbiologists, anaesthetists, would speak about Slutsky's frauds. Slutsky made no secret of it. He even said to me on one occasion he always knew that Darcy was a crook because he's the only person who publishes more than me. So, and he wasn't exposed until '86. So we have big problems in people revealing what's going on. And I wrote about this in the Lancet in 1997. And I described a number of cases which were well known, and you will see at the bottom, I put it here at the bottom, but it's just above the references in the article, that the Lancet asked me to provide documentary evidence corroborating my article was made available to the Lancet. And I had to go through the article sentence by sentence, producing the documents that corroborated every sentence. Now, I'm a cardiologist. I publish papers on heart failure, on myocardial infarction, cardiomyopathy. These have implications for survival of patients, but no journal has ever asked me to corroborate a single sentence, a single word in any of those articles, because the lives of patients are not as valuable to journal editors as the risk of being sued for libel. And I've discovered that. So many of my articles have similar statements. And after I published this, I described cases of cover-up of fraud at King's College London. That was the first time they threatened to sue me. And in 98, I reported two of the doctors concerned, A.K. Banerjee and Tim Peters, to the GMC. And what was clear is that Banerjee was a long-time fraudster. By the time he had been qualified 18 months as a doctor, he had 49 publications. So that's 6 months as an SHO. And there were lots of suspicions. And before he moved to King's, people at his previous jobs were concerned about it. And at King's, 7 whistleblowers reported that he was falsifying research. And in 1990, he had to admit it because he claimed to have used a radioactive isotope that they didn't have. So he said, "Where did you get this?" And so they held an inquiry and found that all of his work at King's was false, but they silenced the 7 whistleblowers, they destroyed the evidence, and they didn't repay any of the research grants to the MRC or the 2 charities that had paid for the research. They then published a further paper, Banerjee and Peters. Tim Peters, I should say, was not only a department head as a professor, he was one of the associate deans, postgraduate deans for London University and King's College. So they published a fraudulent paper. The GMC has found it was fraudulent. It's been retracted. That's after Peters knew that Banerjee was a fraudster. He also let Banerjee publish, submit, his fraudulent research for a Master of Surgery degree for London University, and that's even more remarkable, but because Tim Peters, as I said, was an associate dean at London University, but his particular area, he was the dean for postgraduates and higher degrees. So he lets his research fellow submit a falsified degree, thesis for a higher degree. I reported him to the GMC, and they were both found guilty of serious professional misconduct. Banerjee was then suspended for a year, but Peters got only a severe reprimand. Banerjee got back onto the medical register after a year. The next day I reported him again to the GMC, and after that he was struck off. But he's back on again. You can't keep a good man down. And it took until 2015 to get London University to withdraw this fraudulent degree. Now, the remarkable thing is that before they awarded the degree, a senior lecturer from King's had written to the registrar at the London University pointing out it was fraudulent. And I've got copies of the correspondence because the registrar acknowledges that she has been told it is fraudulent. And yet they gave it the following year in 91. So I wrote about this again, and then King's threatened to sue me again for the second time. Anyway, I also reported Clive Handler to the GMC. He's a cardiologist, and it's slightly different in the sense that he'd embezzled charitable research funds rather than falsifying data, but he'd embezzled the research funds. And I put this in because it shows something about the GMC. The hospital held an inquiry and found that it embezzled the research funds because technicians were complaining about this. And the important thing was that the person who investigated was the medical director, Professor Peter Richards. And he and the trust board agreed a severance deal with Handler that if he went quietly, they would give him a payment, not inform the police and not inform the GMC. And this is important because at the time that Richards was doing the deal to conceal this from the GMC, Richards was a member of the GMC. And he was, in fact, its chief judge. He was chairman of the Professional Conduct Committee. So that has now been renamed the Fitness to Practice Committee, but he was the senior judge, so to speak, because they have various committees: conduct, standards, education, and so on. And Richards actually put himself down to hear the case when Handler appeared. And on the first morning of the case, Richards was ready to chair the hearing, and the GMC's lawyers objected. They said, "You can't hear it, you're conflicted." And he had to recuse himself. And it was, imagine going to the Old Bailey to hear a murder trial, and the judge says, "I'm sorry, I can't, they tell me I can't hear this case because I helped the accused bury the body." And that's what it was like. But despite having to stand down from that case, the GMC allowed Richards to return to hearing cases subsequently. Well, we often hear that science is self-correcting, and that's true as far as we know, because we only know about the cases when it's self-correcting. We don't know about the cases when it isn't self-correcting. And sometimes when it's self-correcting, it doesn't actually help, in a sense. If we think about Andrew Wakefield, we know that he was a crook, that he falsified research, that there is no link between MMR and autism, but that has not stopped the problems we currently have with people refusing to have vaccination and the increase in measles. It's also no consolation to you if you suffer as a result of incorrect treatment or die, to know that in 10 years' time the real best treatment will come out, and the fact that you're getting the wrong treatment because of bad science or falsified research is no consolation. And as an example, I'd like to talk about Don Poldermans in Erasmus Medical Centre, professor at Erasmus in Rotterdam. He was the principal investigator in the series of decrease studies, an acronym. There were 6 of these, and they showed that perioperative betablockers improved survival for high-risk patients having non-cardiac surgery. And also on the Decrease Guidelines Committee was Professor Bax. And between them, they held senior positions at the European Society of Cardiology. Poldermans was a member of the Guidelines Committee and chair of the task force. And not surprisingly then, the European Society of Cardiology produced guidelines recommending perioperative beta blockers for this patient group. The problem was that these multi-centre studies by Poldermans had been made up. It's remarkable, actually, when it was exposed, people who had been his co-authors said, oh, I had nothing to do with this. And how could you miss the fact that your name is a co-author in the New England Journal of Medicine? Would you miss that? People would come up to you and say, oh, great paper in the New England Journal of Medicine. Yet they claim they didn't know anything about it. They didn't contribute any research. Anyway, 5 of the 6 decreased studies we know were, there was misconduct in 5 of them. The first study, none of the data any longer exists, so we don't know about that. Erasmus dismissed Poldermans, and research by other workers in fact show that this treatment increases mortality by 27%. So it's been estimated that about 800,000 patients, excess deaths, occurred as a result of use of the EAC guidelines, about 10% of them in the UK. So we're talking about a number of deaths due to this research comparable to the number of deaths in the current civil war in Syria. And Poldermans is not in prison. How is that? And the ESC guidelines have not been withdrawn. How is that? Well, I mentioned that Bax was also on the guidelines committee. Who was Bax? Well, until last August, he was the president of the ESC. So they didn't want to bring in and discredit their president. But the trouble with those trials is we don't know the identities of these people who've died. It's just statistical number, 800,000, but we don't know which 800,000 patients died as a result. But there are trials where we do know who's died. And this is just a case report in the Lancet of tissue-engineered airway, a transplant of a tissue-engineered airway. The Lancet devoted 8 pages to it. The key bit, which you don't need to read, is here, the findings. You don't need to read them because I've got them on a bigger slide in a moment. But that was published. It was a study by Macerini and Birchall. They were the joint co-principal investigators in this study. And it concerned this lady who, fortunately for her, the airway they transplanted was her left main bronchus and not her trachea. And they found the first sentence, the 2 sentences in white are the sentences that are in the findings. They found, the first one is the important one, the graft immediately provided the recipient with a functional airway, improved their quality of life, and had a normal appearance and mechanical properties at 4 months. That's entirely untrue. In fact, there was no improvement in lung function, and the transplanted airway collapsed after 3 weeks and required a stent. And fortunately for her, as I said, it was the left main bronchus because they then took out her left lung. So this was a pack of lies. The joint senior authors, Macerini then moved from Barcelona to the Karolinska, and it was thought generally that the Karolinska had headhunted this fellow at the cutting edge of research. In fact, the Barcelona clinic had sacked him because they found that he had falsified, he was making false claims. He also got an honorary contract at UCL where Birchall moved from Bristol. And they both continued tracheal transplantation research, which had fatal consequences in Stockholm and in London. In London, we know that Shauna Davidson and Kezia Shorten on the left, age 19, and Shauna Davidson, age 15, died as a result, and I'll come back to that. But at the Karolinska, Macchiarini's contract was terminated in 2016. The investigation found that Macchiarini and 6 co-workers were guilty of misconduct. That's important because although people talk about a rotten apple, in fact, it is very difficult to if you're a co-worker with someone, you have suspicions and you know that things aren't right, nearly always. The Karolinska asked for a retraction of the 6 publications that Macchiarini had produced from there, including 2 in the Lancet, but Lancet has refused to retract the 2008 paper and a follow-up to 5-year paper. And that's despite the fact that the director at the Barcelona clinic, a new director, informed the Lancet that the paper made false claims. Horton has refused repeatedly to retract the paper, even though he knows this paper is false, and that patients are dying around the world as people continue to try to replicate this study. In January, the chairs of the Science and Technology Committee, Norman Lamb, and Health Select Committee, Health and Social Care Committee rather, Sarah Wollaston, jointly wrote to Richard Horton asking him for an explanation of why he hasn't retracted. They kindly sent me a copy of their letter. Birchall has attracted more than £15 million of UK taxpayer and EU money for this research, which experts in stem cell research tell me and have told the Science and Technology Committee cannot possibly work. And UCL, of course, are not doing anything about it because he's earning them a lot of money. So research misconduct is common because the rewards are high, the risk to fraudsters are low, it's concealed by institutions and journals, and I could spend hours telling you of other cases. In fact, the BMJ asked me to give a seminar to their editors, and I said, how long have I got? And they said, you can have 3.5 hours. I said, well, I can't cover it in 3.5 hours. But anyway, and the guilty often escape any serious sanctions. Thanks very much.